Hey everyone, welcome to video number 4 of our two-part series. This is in part 1, the beginner's track, and part 4 we're going to be talking about my first sequence. So how do we store cues into a sequence? How do we name the sequence? And just some housekeeping things. How do we navigate into the cue list? How do we get to some of the options and ways to make just changes to the cue list, make changes to the sequence, how it works, how it fires, how it functions, things like that. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to open up our overlay. And storing your sequence is actually a really easy thing to do. So what we're going to do is we're going to go down here to store, giving us a store command, and we're going to just select any open executor fader. I'm going to give this executor, and let's go ahead and move that over. I'm going to move that here to 35. So we're in executor 5, sequence 79. Just kind of walking through the information. So sequence, there's the default name is sequence, 1 cue, there's no content in it. This is our fader, so if we pull our fader down, so we want it at 100. We also have select, off, and go. I'm going to pull up this virtual. So when we talk about, so these buttons, so that they say empty, empty, this is a fader. Can turn up and down. This is also an empty. When we look at select, off, and go, let's see if we can't actually assign or move this so we can kind of visualize what I'm talking about. Let's move this to here. So select, off, and go. So those are the 3 buttons that are indicated in the, let's go ahead and move this back. The 3 buttons that are indicated right here. So select, off, and go. It's our sequence name, and then also our cue stack. It'll show 3 cues at a time. It'll show you the current one you're on, and the one you're going to, and the one that was before it. So let's go ahead and name our sequence. We're going to hit assign twice. It's going to give us a label command. And we're going to want to select up in here where it says sequence. And let's just label that test version 1A, please. Now giving it a label. Now this sequence is not ready to go. So we're going to hit assign 3 times, give it an appearance, select really the sequence. You don't have to select a specific spot. Change it to red, please. Now that sequence has an indication to anybody who comes in behind you that this sequence is not ready to go. It's still being programmed. It's still being updated. Do not use it in a worship experience. So this is kind of the very first thing. This is basic housekeeping items. So let's go ahead and clear our programmer out, and let's add a second cue. What we're going to do is we're going to hit store, and we're going to, there's several different ways to do this, but we're going to select the sequence again. It's going to give us this prompt: overwrite, merge, status merge, remove, release, create second cue. Anytime you see a option that is highlighted in yellow, that means it's a default option, and you can go ahead and actually hit store, select it, and hit please, because it's going to automatically create a second cue. Let's say you only have 1 cue in this sequence. It's like a hit or something, something that you're busking or you're playing over top of another sequence. You might just go ahead and hit merge, because you're not actually wanting to create a second cue. In this case, we want to create a second cue. So we're going to hit that. Automatically going to give us a second cue. Now, let's say we want this sequence has 10 cues in it, and we don't want to just hit store and tap the do that 5 times, or a bunch of times to add cues. We just want to add 8 more cues. So what we're going to do, this is also another thing to note. If we look here in the master playback window, you're going to see it says magenta flow. That is not the sequence that we are working on. We are currently wanting to work on the test version 1A sequence. So how do we select that? There's a couple of different ways. One, you can hit the select button, which is a physical button on the executor fader. It's the top button, which is located up here. This is just a virtual representation of the actual fader that you have. Or we can actually press select and select that sequence. So now we see this is the sequence that we're working on. It's got a green background. It's in the master playback window. This is and so this is now basically our active sequence that any content that we store, we can go ahead and store. We can make sure is storing in this sequence. So what we want to do is we want to add 8 more cues. We're going to hit store cue. We already have 1, 2, so we're going to do 3 through 10. We're going to hit please. And now, as we can see, we have 10 cues in this test sequence. So there's a couple of different options that we are able to select here. We can select up here. I'm going to select it, and it's going to take us to this options window. And we can also select down here in where our cues live, and it's going to take us to this options menu. So depending on what you're wanting to do, you may need to make sure where you're selecting actually matters. So let's say we want to check on our basically like our sequence options menu. So we have these are our buttons, our physical buttons. So we have select, off, master, and go. So let's say we wanted to change this go button to be a toggle or a temp. Those are really great for things like hits, any sort of, maybe you've just built an effect and assigned it to a sequence or stored it to a sequence and assign that to an executor. You might want to just change that to be a temp or a toggle button. Toggle just means I hit it once, I turn it on. I hit it again, I turn it off, just like a toggle button, just like you think. Off, you can, all kinds of different options here that you have. Also with the master, it's a little bit different. You have temp fader, speed masters, things like that. You have an options menu. We're not going to really go into this. I'm more just showing you where this stuff is. In the event you have to access it, you actually know how to access it. We're going to go to, so we've already selected up here. Seen that. We're going to go to our cue stack. How you get to that is you just select down here where your 3 cues are, and that's going to take us to our cue stack. So we've got 10 cues. This is where you can label. When it comes to labeling, you don't need to hit assign and select it. In fact, you actually can't do that. Usually when it's highlighted like that, you can go ahead and just start typing. So we're going to just start typing. So we have, and it'll, once you hit enter, it'll drop down to the next cue. So I have a mark cue. We're going to have like an intro cue, verse, chorus, verse, chorus. We're going to have a build, a big, a down, and an end. So labeling can go really, really fast. We have, so that's our name. This is our number, our cue number. Our name, we have our trigger, so how we want it to trigger. If we right click on go, the other thing that you can do is you can do a long press and it will simulate, be the same as a right click. So we have go, time, follow, sound, BPM, time code. Primarily, we're going to be functioning in these 3, go, time, and follow. Timing we use when we time out our songs. So you hit go on the 1 on the verse, and it will play out the whole song. Follow we use, so as soon as that first cue has played through, it will follow right to the next cue. And then we also have go, which you actually have to hit the go button in order to kind of hear me hitting the go button to go to the next cue. So I'm going to hop back up here to Mark. So we have trigger time. That's if you're using time. You can also use follow to add, take away time. So if we did a follow here and we did 2 seconds, it's going to give you a +2. So what that means is when I hit go, it's going to take 2 seconds before it follows to the next one. So if we had a fade time here of 2 seconds, 2 + 2 is 4. Last time I checked. So it's going to take 2 seconds for the cue to come in, and then another 2 seconds for it to go to the next cue. So that's how you can use follow time and things like that. You can also, you have all of these set to 0. You can do a marquee and select all of them. Right click, and what I do is I set everything to 4 seconds. Reason for that is I don't really want anything to, if I want it to snap, which is a 0 time, I actually want to put it in. So I set everything to 4 seconds just as like a default. And so now as I bump through, everything's going to take 4 seconds to fade to the next. You can kind of see that visually represented there. We're not going to really talk too much about anything else kind of down the line. One thing to note is for like our mark cue, I still got this follow time in there, so it's going to go ahead and follow. For this mark cue, you will often see a command line input here. If we right click here, and I'm going to pull the command overlay. So we've got our, I'm going to kind of show you, you can physically put in, so if this is, if we want this to shut off sequence or executor 1, we'll hit off executor 1, please. And that's going to throw a command in there. The command delay is super important because we want that to be the same fade time as our fade time. So we want a command delay of 4 seconds. So it's going to wait 4 seconds before it executes this command. So if we have, let's just go ahead and assign a cue there. So if we go ahead and fire and hit go on this first cue, you're going to see this shut off. Should have shut off in 4 seconds. Oh, 31. I had the command wrong. This works when you're on like a fader wing. I forgot these were set to 31. So if we hit change that to 31, how you know which executor it is in the top left corner. You see 31, 32, 33, 34. So we're in 35. Turn this off. We're going to go ahead and fire this sequence, and now we're going to fire our test sequence. 1, 2, 3, 4, and we should see this go ahead and shut off. If we notice that it just shut off, it snapped off. If we look in any of our options we have here, which we have quite a few timing options, there's no off time in here. How you access the off time, we can see we have it down here, but if we change to any other parameter, how do you get back to that? The only way to get back to having an off time is to actually open up the cue list. So we open up the cue list. We're going to close that out. Now we have our off time. We're going to select that, and we're actually going to set it to 2 seconds. I'm going to hit please. We're going to turn off our test sequence, and we're going to turn on our kind of dummy sequence here. We're going to go ahead and fire our test sequence. Now watch this blue fade. It's going to take 2 seconds to fade off. Sometimes that can, reason why I'm kind of showing you that is that can help with transitions if for whatever reason, the timing's not working out. You can add in an off time and that can kind of fade. Typically we don't want things to snap all the times unless it's very intentional. Some of that is like getting into more advanced timings and things like that. But that's kind of going through how to store a cue. One thing to note that's kind of important why we have this mark cue is we put all of our information. So just to be aware, we haven't stored any content in these. We have just basically built kind of what I call like the bones, so to speak. This is kind of the framework for you to put your content into. So you'll put all of your dimmer information, your color information, position information, anything that pertains to this cue stack, all of that is going to live in this first cue. And the reason for that is what we call tracking. And what it does, we'll get into this more on the advanced side, but what it does is it basically allows us one spot to have to change really anything. If we want to change a color, we can store it in Q1. If we want to change a position, we can change it in Q1, and then that's going to track through all of these. Unless, let's say in chorus, we do like a crowd sweep or something, then we have to change it there as well. But primarily, we want everything to live in this first cue, which is called mark. Everything, it's like our lights are marked for this look. That's why we use that term. So if we wanted to put content, so let's say in our first cue, and let's just kind of go over, we have our test sequence selected. We know that because it's green. We have our mark cue in blue, which means it's fired, it's on. LTP, this is our fader, so we know it's going to be on. So let's go ahead and select our fixtures. If we hit at, we hit at twice. It's going to turn them on to full. And we're going to hit store Q1, please. It's going to give us this prompt. Because we're changing what is stored in that first cue, it's just asking us, hey, do you want to overwrite? Very rarely do we want to overwrite. That's why merge is the default. Status merge, remove, release, things like that. We want to merge this data because it's taking the new content, which is these are now at 100, and merging it with what content, which there wasn't any content, in the first cue. Clear that out. We've cleared the programmer. We now see that those lights are there. So if we bump through Q1 through Q10, we can see this is the tracking at work. We can see that those lights are still at 100. If we go to the second cue, and let's say we want to change the color of them to orange. Let's hop back to our layout view. So we've changed them to orange. Command overlay. We're going to hit store Q2, please. Again, we're changing information. We want to merge. You can also hit please twice. So we can hit store Q2, please, and it's going to store that information into the queue. Clear it out. Now, if we turn that queue off, or that sequence off, we hit go, they're going to come up in white, and then in Q2, they're going to change to red. So this, I'm only going to show you a couple of parameters, but this kind of method applies to position, gobos, these are profiles, color, beam, any sort of focus. You give these lights parameters, you turn them on, you turn them off, you change them color, you move them around. The same principle applies. Store queue, whatever you want, whatever queue you want that information in. As long as you have the sequence that you are working on selected, it's going to go in that queue. And you always want to, not always, but most of the time you want to overwrite, or not overwrite, Most of the time you want to merge. Rarely do we want to overwrite. So this has been it's been a little bit of a longer video because it's a little bit more in depth. But hopefully by the end of this video, you'll be able to select your fixtures, apply content to them, store your first cues and your sequences, and do all of the housekeeping that is required of that, change fade times, things like that. Very basic sequence creation. This is actually video 4. The next videos are going to be basically more advanced, kind of getting into timings, transitions, effects, and things like that. But yeah, this is video 4. Congratulations, you've gotten through the first 4 videos of our basic MA training videos.